Well, there we go. Okay. So hello everyone and welcome back. Today we have an event with Dennis Yao, who is here on behalf of the subset of theoretic practice, a very large and interesting research organization working on basically the a science. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a science of organizational concatenation with a post-capitalist focus, correct?
Yeah, I think that would we haven't used those terms, but yeah, I think that would be pretty accurate.
Perfect.
Um,
I'm just kind of ad-libbing it right now. So yeah, today he'll be giving a presentation that he wanted to give at our conference up in Canada. But life happened and it didn't really work out for that. So we're gonna have that talk today. It'll be kind of a shorter talk, maybe 45 minutes to an hour if we have conversation for that. If we have time for that conversation and everything. And the presentation will be on political, theoretical, and computational models. Um, so yeah, I guess I'll hand it over to Dennis. Take it away.
all right. Thanks so much, Leon, for inviting me. Very excited to be here. And yeah, I was talking about there's just so much stuff that we have researched in our group, and so much stuff we want to share with y'all, and also have have you guys share with us as well. So I'm hoping that this is first of many encounters we can have. Um, But yeah, so let's start. I want to begin, with a quick disclaimer about the concepts I'm going to present. These concepts were developed within a collective setting called the common space of theoretical practice. We recently did a rename and upgraded from set theory to topology. Um, but we are a para-academic group, much like INDEP. CSTP is also part of a larger collective called the Common Space of Organizations, or CSO. And CSO, like its name entails, is building ways for organizations to connect with one another on both a social and material basis. And one such project has been developing rural producers associations and maintaining economic instruments such as popular banks in south of Bahia in Brazil. CSO also facilitates workshops, studies, and joint projects between orgs with widely different backgrounds. So I'm speaking here today from the theory and research side, which plays a crucial but intermediate role in CSO. In order to build the type of articulations that we do, we must develop conceptual tools that facilitate honing in on how each organization we work with is structured and how they approach their impasses and strategies. So fieldwork, shared activities, and sometimes highly abstract theory is needed to actually mediate this type of practice and these, varying relationships. So I'm hoping that this presentation also serves as a good introduction to our orientation, which I can maybe summarize as there should be a way to talk about political organizations and political economy as if they are the same thing. Um, so yeah, let me advance the slide here. Um, and a lot of things follow from this basic axiom. It kind of forces us to reconceptualize terms like politics, economics, and organization, which are really broad concepts. So my first goal is to try and give you a sense of what those terms mean for CSO and how this reconceptualization might be useful for the democratic planning space. And I'm hoping that this will open up new ways of thinking about the design and implementation of planning systems. So first, I want to start with a question about the role of politics in democratic planning. So I think we can all generally agree that adding more mechanisms of collective decision making, inclusion, and justice in our society is good, and we should always strive for that. But I want to put forward two claims about this position. First, I think that being more politically engaged actually raises more problems than it solves. And second, this is a good thing because the more political our systems become, the more connected they are to the parts of society which are currently invisible, and the more our planning system will be shaped by those invisible or marginalized elements. But we should be honest here that this will raise a lot of problems, both technical and social ones, that have really never been raised before under capitalism. So, so my question is like, if more politics means more problems, and our default inclination is to want to solve problems, then, don't we need to cultivate some kind of self-critical function in ourselves, right? So as we partake in new experiments in planning, I think we'll have to keep asking ourselves a naive question. Why do we want all of these political mechanisms if they seem to slow us down or create conflicts that we can't ever fully resolve? And of course, we can name a lot of abstract benefits that come with political engagement. But I think it would be better if we had a more comprehensive answer to this question that didn't rely on some kind of abstract benefit, but instead we had more explanatory power here. So I think it would be useful to have a theory about politics and social systems that answers this question. And my next claim then is that politics doesn't really fit the naive cybernetic picture of a system and its environment. Advance the slide here. The way I see this naive picture is there is a social environment which is out there, and we can posit it as a society or even better, an economy. And then within that, there are many subsystems, and one of those is our planning system, which should then interact or mediate with this wider environment. One of the big themes of our research in the past few years has been on this concept of the environment. So I'll try to distill that and show why this simplified picture raises some problems. First, and this is something you might find in second order cybernetics, in a sense here, an environment is not an empty placeholder for everything that's out there, right? It contains only what for a given system is capable of being interacted with or perceived by that system. So in that sense, it functions as a kind of reflection of the internal composition of the system itself, right? So if the system doesn't have eyes to see something, then it won't see it. So it's a reflection of what the system is capable of. Um, and that means that the existence or non-existence of something in the environment is not an absolute thing. It must always be referred to a given system in its current configuration. Under this framework, instead of trying to build a single optimized planning system, we would actually have several, each with distinct but overlapping environments. So that's the first point. Second, and I think this is more important, the way that things appear in an environment is always tailored to what affords something for the system, meaning that it translates into something that is in the internal model of that system, something that can impact the cost of its self-reproduction. So implicitly here, the kinds of systems we care about they have some kind of notion of self-reproduction, right? We're not just talking about like a thermostat, like a control system in the normal sense. But this raises a challenge that I'll try to put in the following way. Any system left to its own devices will settle into a state of stable self-reproduction. And in the case of social systems, this is not necessarily ideal for the things that we want, right? A capitalist market-driven system only sees what it needs to see to continue itself, which is why we need to have perturbations. We need to alter it in many ways from the outside to keep it even minimally aligned with human interests. Right, so that's an example of a system that settles into this state. Finally, when we implement a planning system, we should not think of it as connecting that system to an environment. Instead, we are connecting the system to a pre-existing social system that has its own environment, which may only partially overlap with that of the planning system. And the fact that the environments are not the same means that integrating those systems will produce generative effects that we can't trace back to either of them. In other words, no matter what feedback loops we've set up to try to adjust, there will always be uncaptured information about the behavior of the new composite system. And this will be true regardless of how simple or complex our planning schema is. So that's not to say there are not better or worse designs, just that even with the best designs, we won't know which knobs to turn to mitigate the negative or unintentional effects. So these are the three reasons why the model of having like an environment or economy or society on the one hand and the planning system on the other is too simple, right? It's faulty. So to summarize, one, there is no single environment, but there is one for every planning system. Two, planning systems, once they become realized, will tend to just reproduce themselves rather than promote democracy, for example. And three, materializing a planning system will produce generative effects that we can't really trace back to the design of the system itself. So we don't know what to change to fix it. So here, it might seem like I'm starting to sound like Hayek, which is to say I'm giving some a priori reasons why planning won't work. Instead, I'm proposing that politics is not a system or an environment, but is something that can traverse both of these terms. Politics is the name for how we collectively navigate these limitations of social systems. Hayek and all market fundamentalists would likely accept that the issues I've presented about these systems, but he would translate it as they contain informal knowledge, and he would definitely reject my premise about politics. Hayek would say that markets are exactly the right solution, the universal solution to the problem of the density of informal knowledge of social systems. This is the theoretical premise that has basically taken over the world. But I believe we should not discard the premise that society contains informal information or knowledge, but we should question the nature of this knowledge and how it's realized. Yes, markets can reach into the depths of society and make use of some types of information, but they also filter out the most critical types. And I think this is self-evident for us and anyone interested in democratic planning, right? We want to base our economies on collective decisions rather than the market because we believe there are other kinds of information which impact human flourishing over long time horizons and are not captured by the market. So our description of how social information can be turned into planning decisions, we're really inspired by Benenab's recent work, especially those two essays titled Beyond Capitalism. But I think from also the CSO perspective, what we want to add to that is, in addition to the coordinated function of politics, we should also consider its perturbative function. So here, I have a quote from Benanav I can read, which is emblematic of this idea of politics as coordination. So the economy becomes, in short, self-reflective, not just stable in the aggregate, but responsive to the multiplicity of values and conditions it must continually balance. The result is a system that can sustain what earlier designs only approximated, a sustainable plural form of coordination in which different domains of value, economic performance, ecological responsibility, and social purpose remain linked but non-convertible, right? And that last part is really important, that we can't just have one universal conversion thing like a universal currency that connects these things. So we definitely agree with that, but we want to add this idea of like a perturbation, right? So here I have on the left one of my favorite pictures, which is you know one of the members of the Little Rock Nine, um, who were the first black high school students in the United States. And you can kind of see, I wanted to show this contrast between like having, um, you know, magnetic field lines revealed by iron. Um, you kind of can see those magnetic field lines, right? So that's like a perturbation in the magnetic field. Similarly, you can have that same effect in the social world by basically producing something that world doesn't normally see, right? So we can go further into that type of investigation. So here I just want to establish that when I say political process, I'm not talking about just voting or, um, you know, that's part of the coordinated function. But there's also this other thing that politics does that I think is equally important, right? So, for example, we should think seriously about the question, how do we know the limitations of the market in the first place? If we do know its limitations, I argue that this must mean there is another source of information such that we could compare this source to the price system and the market. So I want to propose that this other source is visible whenever we organize ourselves politically. That is to say, not because we are being paid to do it or to reproduce ourselves, but in order to enact changes in society. And this view extends beyond just political projects that are successful in achieving some kind of lasting change. On the local level, every time we collectively decide on a new set of goals that are not downstream from profit, around which we plan and execute those plans, we are in effect turning Hayek against himself to some degree, because we are transforming informal knowledge into something useful without relying on the market. Regardless of whether we succeed or fail, we can always learn something about one, how we formulated our goals, two, how we try to achieve them, or three, the social environment that we're a part of. So this process of extracting informal knowledge through organizing ourselves is how I am conceiving of a political process. And so now we can enlarge our picture from being just about the planning system and the social environment to being the interaction between planning, political processes, and the environment. And this gives us new problems to consider, which are the problems at the boundary between each subsystem. So, for example, how does politics interact with the social environment, and how does planning interact with these pre-existing political processes? Of course, political processes are usually very costly for everyone involved, since it is by the definition above at a distance from the market, which means we don't have a single signal like profits or losses, or even effort to really guide us. Maybe we could say that politics is not about optimizing or minimizing costs, but it's about finding new ways to measure the cost of something. And in this process, we are forced to iteratively explore the different possibilities, which is both a form of liberation and a source of new constraints, especially since this exploration is happening inside of the existing social environment, which brings all of its existing issues. I believe computational tools can help to speed up this iterative process, right? Such as allowing us to simulate how our plans might be executed based on our assumptions. But they're not a panacea because of the above mentioned problem that implementing a computer program as a social system will automatically produce these higher order effects again. So people do not organize themselves in a vacuum, right? They have certain constraints they must organize under. I like to characterize this as many different kinds of connective tissue hidden beneath the skin. Many of our individual constraints are not even apparent to ourselves, at least without further investigation. We as individuals also have this mental model of what works, and so we're attracted towards forms we recognize as successful because it is very costly to do otherwise. So I think it's not a matter of handing people a ready-made solution, but something like integrating or grafting step by step a new prosthetic device into an existing social organism. And that always comes with the risk that it might be rejected. So we might, for example, disagree on exactly what the name for this iterative process is. We could say it's democratic, socialist, communist, anarchist. The plurality of terms here just tells us that there's likely many more non-market decision procedures than that we can properly categorize. And in CSDP, we call this a multiplicity property of politics, meaning politics is irreducibly multiple. We can't unify it into a single thing, right? So my point is that when we are building new planning systems, we should not think that we are building from scratch, but that we're, latching onto or sharpening something that already exists, which is not a theoretical thing, but something that's political in nature. And taking that into account might improve how we build our systems. It also helps us avoid certain ideological traps, which I'll soon talk about. Our starting point in designing planning systems should not be a vacuum, but must be based on the concrete situation with expectations and mental models. Um, a stronger version of this thesis is that planning systems should always be tailored for a particular organization. And if we accept this thesis, that means we should have a pretty strong grasp of the organizational dynamics at play as well as their pathologies. And here I'm drawing not from cybernetics, but from its Soviet precursor, techtology, a term coined by the Bolshevik Alexander Bogdanov. He posited a science of organization in general that would unite all the other sciences. And in my view, what separates techtology from cybernetics is the fact that politics is a unique process built into techtology's idea of regulation, in contrast to first order cybernetics, where control and optimization is something you introduce from the outside, and even I would say second order cybernetics, where control is treated from the standpoint of systems. But like I said, politics is not a system. Um, and we could argue whether like Stafford Beer is a technologist or second order cyberneticist. I think he's more, on the side of technology. But yeah, from a technological viewpoint, different political processes are themselves witnesses to the different kinds of information embedded in social systems. And this is much richer than the information that these individual systems can detect. That's because they actively work to perturb the social systems in which they are a part. So, to use this example again, an organization dedicated to fighting racism will disturb the racist elements of society, allowing it to detect its contours and trace how far this racism reaches, right? This is what's called structural racism, whether that is in our legal institutions, our schools, prison system, military, and so on. So if we want our planning system to be anti-racist or in service of that cause, then we obviously need to take this information into account. And I don't have time to completely elaborate on our theory of organizations, but earlier we said that political processes should not be thought of as systems, which is how we got out of the cybernetic trap. But political organizations are also organizations, and that is to say they are systems. So there are certainly problems we need to deal with that don't simply go away just because we start calling them political organizations. And I want to highlight one important point here that pertains to planning, right? The contradiction that all political organizations face is that they themselves depend upon aspects of the existing system that they are trying to change. So there's always a tension that may resolve itself in compromise to find a middle ground between revolution and the status quo. Implementing a planning system doesn't resolve this contradiction, but rather moves the question to that of exogenous versus endogenous variables. An exogenous variable is one that the planning system cannot see. Therefore, it must rely on the political procedure undertaken by an organization. Exogenous variables, therefore, form a site for either compromise or struggle. For example, a planning system might be able to internally represent and therefore control for the quantity of tomatoes available for consumption, but it may require as an input the free time we have available to produce tomatoes. So under certain conditions, which a cybernetician may call, sufficient requisite variety, and what we in CSO might call a material basis, we are able to partially detach a variable, such as the quantity of tomatoes, from the existing capitalist world. But there will still be a fight for more free time, as long as workers haven't been completely extricated from capitalism. So we've established that planning systems are also social systems and therefore depend upon the capacity to capture the social information that is not in its environment. And the best way to do this is to integrate with political organizations, which, because their purpose is to perturb society, are capable of producing this new information that can eventually become the new signals of our planning system. And therefore, the limitations of the planning system are coupled to the limitations of this political capacity of the organization. And this limitation goes in both ways, right? Because the planning system, as it becomes accepted by the organization, will start to add constraints to the organization as well. And here, the limitations of an organization are, by definition, its boundaries. And this doesn't only include the boundary between the system and the environment, but also the boundaries between different systems and, in a dual sense, between different environments. And I think this is the where the real challenge begins, because if we want to have as many diverse sources of social information we can get, we can't expect a single massive organization to give us what we want, right? Because of the rule of one environment per system. Instead, we need a lot of different organizations, each with their own perspective on the world. So we'd like to develop a formal way to talk about the boundaries that can be extensible and robust, given that we know that new types of information can arise politically. And we can think of these boundaries as interfaces with types or ports that let two organizations share information. A lot of these types are ultimately informal. For example, being polite to someone from a different background, respecting their opinion. This isn't really something you can enforce with a formal contract. And the other side of that would be when two organizations have a conflict. That's also a form of sharing information that isn't formally specified. Um, so it's here where I think computational models ultimately reside, and we can also see their limitations, right? They enable us to translate the types of one organization into another. And given everything we've discussed, I think the question is less about which computational model we pick, and instead how we organize the production and sharing of these models. We need to, in some sense, plan for the political when building these models. But this is tricky because the boundaries of what is political depends on which organizations are latching onto the planning strategy, right? Because each organization has its own perspective of what is political. So we need a formal strategy for introducing and managing the types and information that are already circulating between these organizations. And we could call this a strategy or theory of social information. We need to deal with the fact that this type of information is never neutral, but is always part of a battleground. And to appropriate a phrase from Althusser, we would need a conflictual science to study it. Regardless of whether you want to name this science Marxism, as Althusser does, we still need a way to unearth this social information, to organize it, to like filter it out, and to make it useful. And we need to agree that, or we do agree that at least some of it is implicit, right? It's disavowed or buried under what is called ideology. And here, by invoking ideology, I'm already using a political category, right? Because it implies relations of dominance. At the individual level, ideology is indistinguishable from our habits and habitual relations with others. But at the social level, we can distinguish ideology from habit insofar as the former functions to reproduce certain relations of dominance. So, for example, at the individual level, you might treat men and women differently, and this is what you're used to, what your family and early life experiences have instilled in you, and you don't really see it harming anyone. What makes our ways of responding to gender differences ideological is when it helps to reproduce a patriarchal society. So that's when that difference starts to make a difference. And this is Bateson's definition of information, in fact. So my point here is that information and ideology are inextricably linked at the social level. To be cognizant of something as ideological, you have to accept certain premises, which are put forward and sustained through these political movements, right? We would have never known about a patriarchal society without the feminist movement, for example. And political movements like feminism are what make it possible to distinguish this ideology from our everyday habits. So you can begin to see how this would pose a challenge to designing this information system or this fair economy if what defines fairness is inherently political and part of this ongoing fight in society. So figuring out what is ideological and what is true social information depends on taking a certain political stance, and also depends on the investigation that takes place in conjunction with the development of our models. So let's say, for example, we're building a computational planning system that takes into account all the goods and services, production costs, including various kinds of labor, that we want to collectively control for, right? These are the endogenous variables of our system. But since we're trying to connect the system to the movement for a more just distribution, for example, of care work, we need to represent gender differences in our system. And here I think we should refer to those excellent talks in Montreal on this topic of social reproduction. But if we were to design this computational model of social reproduction issues, we would need to add something like a gender type and a domestic labor type or a care work type to our system. And by adding these types to the model, we are able to express new constraints around our desired outcome. For example, around the disparity between genders in domestic work, right? We can start to say, like, we don't want this disparity to grow too high, so like let's add a constraint there. But we're only able to do that because we've added those types. Now we can already see ideological problems on the horizon, right? How many genders are in our representation? Do we count domestic labor hours the same as other productive activities? These are these are obviously political questions that cannot be answered in a theoretical setting, but they have major impacts on the performance of the planning system. So we could imagine here that we should be using tools that software developers already use to socialize these models, such as creating branches of code bases or allowing sets of plugins and configurations um, that enable different compositions of representations of the social world. So in this vision, different organizations would formalize their perspectives and publish it as a set of types or functions and rules that could be incorporated into other organizations' models of the world. So that that constraint about like domestic labor and gender, that doesn't have to be every organization's job, right? Certain organizations care about that. They want to investigate it and experiment with it. So the results of that experiment can then be shared. And we need some kind of formal way of doing that, that type of sharing. But because politics is multiple and therefore there is no single model, um, we need better tools for organizing these representations. So this pattern of open source, politically motivated software mirrors the way that political processes already interact and shape each other. So just to summarize here, I think there's basically 4 points I wanted to cover. One, we should not conceive of society as a single system, but it's a bunch of systems, each with their own not necessarily overlapping environments. Two, politics has to do with this generative effects of system coupling, as well as all these unaccounted for parameters that are invisible to all the environments. Three, democratic planning needs to have a strategic partnership with political organizations. And four, um, one of the way these unaccounted information might appear is through building them into types into our computational models. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Let's go ahead and end the recording here, and then we'll go to our Q&A.